So hello, everyone, and welcome to In This Together, How Four Ventures Are Leading the Pandemic Relief Effort. I'm Maura Kelly. Thank you for joining us. With me today is Brian McCabe, co-founder of Methyl, Caitríona Clarke, chairperson of Ashling Irish Community Centre and Sláinte 2020, Denny Moore, CEO of Options and the Robin Hood Project, and Shaun Kelly, Vice Chair, Ireland Funds America. So the theme of the conference today is rebuilding. But before you can rebuild, you have to rise up. You have to mobilize, you have to organize. And that's what these individuals did today and for the last few months in various ways. We have two grassroots efforts, we have one corporate initiative, and we have a large philanthropic organization. But let's start with Brian, who co-founded Methyl to really help the frontline healthcare workers. So tell us, how did the Methyl come about, and how did the mission evolve?
Thank you, Caitríona. I'm very glad to be here and to share this forum with the likes of you all, and particularly Caitríona, who was very early on involved with us before she went on to continue with Sláinte 2020. A very, very worthy endeavor that's going to be a long-term one. But in response to your question, what we did was we recognized in the initial stages of the pandemic, as it started ramping up, many of our processes, many of our institutions were caught kind of flat-footed. And I always was of the belief that our community does best when it actually engages. It was very difficult in this particular crisis that everybody was socially distanced, everybody was isolated, and it created great anxiety. Modeling my effort and the effort of my colleagues on the Methyl of 2012 post-Sandy here, where we mobilized the Irish and Irish American community to do good works regionally in response to that. We organized a cadre of people with both experience from those efforts, from medical professions, from the legal professions, and then also with my co-chair, Sophie Colgan, identified a number of young leaders who are rising in the Irish American community to create this committee and then to hit the ground running. What we saw was an opportunity as Irish-owned and Irish-staffed construction firms and such stood down as a result of the economic impact. Much personal protective equipment was shelved. Caitríona's organization was one of the drop-off points where we were able to first reach out to our colleagues and our community members in the construction trades and salons and such, and we were able, as that personal protective equipment was going unused as the construction trade stood down, we were able to repurpose it, get it donated, get our people to appropriately, in a disciplined manner, minding themselves as far as not spreading the contagion and being protective of themselves, to be able to deliver it on the ground to the healthcare workers who were ramping up to face this unprecedented crisis.
Right, so Brian, you're on the front lines. You've been on the front lines for many years, in the police force, and certainly now through your work in the hospital system. So you saw the supply and demand was a big issue. There was a demand, but there was no supply. How did you source these PPE equipment? You got them from the construction workers, the salons, you gathered them, and then what did you do for distribution? Were you at the hospitals every weekend? How did you distribute them?
Yeah, thank you, Maura. What we did, well, what we thought was necessary was to clearly define the mission. And the mission was, A, to provide personal protective equipment as quickly as possible to that frontline staff while that scarcity existed. The second was, as we raised funds, to be very, very transparent and clear in how those funds would be dispersed. And so there was a double track on that as well. The initial gathering of equipment and donated equipment was distributed by the committee members and volunteers to hospitals and healthcare organizations that we identified as being either not-for-profits or public hospitals that wouldn't have a larger economic support structure that some of the larger medical networks would have. And so we did deliver on the ground. We prearranged through these hospitals and their organizations, their foundations, to make those deliveries. We then, as we didn't want to add to the crisis of, for instance, what a specific piece of equipment, a pallet, say, in early March that would have gone for $200,000, I was able to find out through some due diligence, was going for $1.2 million by mid-April. So we didn't want to enter that market and help artificially raise prices as well. So what we were able to do, we were able to source personal protective equipment outside of that supply chain, and therefore not compete with the hospitals themselves and raise the prices. And then those sourced PPEs we were able to include in our distribution, which only wrapped up last week. We also saw as an opportunity with the fundraising to make restricted direct donations that would go to these at-risk healthcare organizations, and it would be restricted to the purchase of personal protective equipment for the staff. Despite the other glaring economic problems they may have, our goal and our mission and what the community in their generosity in supporting of it we committed to would only go to the purchase of that personal protective equipment. And we were also able to provide some relief and support to the healthcare staff by also using some funds to give a shot in the arm to some of our community restaurants to provide quality meals to the nursing staff and the frontline staff. So we had those three goals, and we're very, very happy that through the diligent work of the committee and the great generosity of our community, we were able to fulfill those goals.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Brian. You painted a great picture. So I want to go to Danny quickly. You had a similar mission. You mobilized your team at Options and you mobilized your workforce. And together you identified that that's where the real need was, and that's really what you were going to contribute. But just tell us how it came about internally, and again, your distribution process or how you activated it.
Well, I think the way it came about for us is, we pride ourselves on having good listening skills and, trying to listen a little bit better to the customer, and they will tell you what they need. And what became clear through the middle of March was, first of all, that we had a large number of staff who had family members, partners, or close friends working in frontline units in Belfast, New York, and London. But also that a lot of the specific easy things that they needed on a day-to-day basis weren't being provided. So some really simple things, because the hospitals were shut down, the vending machines weren't getting filled, so there's no bottled water. The canteens weren't operating in the hospital, so there were no meals for staff. Staff were having to work multiple shifts without getting home, so toiletries, towels, really, really simple things mattered. So the way we approached the initiative was, once it became clear there was a need, we simply sent around an all-staff email to see who was interested in volunteering. We had 30 responses within 10 minutes, so we kind of figured out we had a team. And then we set a set of operating principles, which were to talk directly to people in frontline units, listen carefully to figure out the easy things that we could deliver that they needed. And then we wanted to deliver maximum impact by getting stuff delivered on the ground very, very fast and quicker than government. Now, as what we found out was, first of all, there were an awful lot of very simple, easy wins. And also we found out that by acting fast and doing a little bit of marketing, we were able to nudge government into action. So, for example, we figured out pretty quickly that our effort could not fund test kits for the entire health service in Northern Ireland or New York, but we got some test kits delivered to the city hospital, got a photograph, on the website, and within a day the government had figured out how to solve the problem. Similarly, we delivered several thousand hero mask visors to the Mater Hospital in Belfast. Whenever we went to order more the next day, the government had already stepped in and ordered the next 12 weeks of production for those same hospitals. So we figured out that we could create an impact both by what we did, but also by prompting government to act, which is obviously way more efficient.
Yes, well, there you go. You mobilize your workforce and you mobilize the government. So you got double whammy. So going through this COVID journey, the relief efforts, so what were some highlights for you when you look back and reflect, that some pivotal moments that just stick in your mind?
The highlights we had, the real highlight was the amount of gratitude that we were shown. I got phone calls, emails from friends all around the country whose family members, partners, colleagues working in the hospitals were telling them what a great job we were doing. It got to the stage where I was bumping into people walking down the street while I was walking the dog who worked in the hospitals, who were aware of what we did. And some of these people were people that I'd never actually spoken to before. Now, that's obviously a double-edged sword, because you don't necessarily want to be approached by a doctor who is working in a COVID ward at the time. But the level of impact and gratitude was just beyond belief. And I think everyone in Options felt that.
Yeah, that's important for the employees to feel like they're making a contribution too. In such a time of high anxiety, you can channel it. You can channel your anxiety. And the same for Brian, I think. You basically gave the community an outlet where they could channel their anxiety and get involved and help their community. So all of the panelists did that. And that's a main point of the impact too. You're not only mobilizing yourself, but you're presenting an outlet for the community to get involved. But now I want to move on to Caitríona and to Shaun, because I want to focus on the social consequences of the pandemic, which are huge. I think certainly the pandemic exacerbates the inequalities in society, and what you're both doing is more specifically, Caitríona, you are really helping out those with financial assistance through Sláinte 2020. So if you could remind us again who the partners are, how this came together, and then we'll go a little deeper after that.
Okay, thanks for that, Maura, and also congratulations to Danny and Brian. When I've heard what you've done, it just there are striking similarities between the structures and what we've done. I think we're all coming from the same place. But the partners that were organising this were the Ashling Centre, the Emerald Isle, the Emerald Isle Immigration Centre, the New York GAA, the New York Irish Centre, and the United Irish Counties. We all came together because we identified a need that was very prevalent in New York, that people were out of work with very little notice. And what we realised very quickly was that a lot of people are living paycheck to paycheck. Now, the reason it came about so quickly is because we were in the bar business ourselves, and my husband and I got word on the 16th of March that we were shutting down. So obviously our staff were out of work for the foreseeable future. Our business was closed. And I think that was the immediate realization that this is going to be a long-term thing, which led us to looking at the number of people who are out of work with little or no financial assistance outside of, with little or no financial assistance from the government. And be that people who are undocumented, or people who might maybe be working off the books and be receiving, there's a cash economy here in New York, and a lot of people were without their income very quickly. So that was really where the need came about. And we have been talking about it. The Irish government were very, very helpful. And it just brings to mind something that Danny said, that like when we were mobilised, it really urged the government to step in because they were very, very helpful. But in a very short space of time, we set up an organisation that was composed of 5 trustworthy organisations with a long history in the community, where people were willing to donate because we had a strategy in place. It also goes to what Brian said, is that we had identified our need very quickly. We had defined the mission, and we were very transparent about the process. We put in eligibility criteria, verification procedures, and guidelines for determining awards, because there was an awful lot of work in setting it up. And once that was done, then we had to wait for the applications to come in and the funding.
What you was, an exemplary example of community coalition building. You brought in other entities that were trustworthy, had a long track record, and together you put together a strategy and a model that, you could actually duplicate and replicate around the country. So I see it as something that could last for a while, and certainly the model is something you could share with other groups.
Well, without a doubt, and within a couple of weeks of setting it up, in fairness, the Irish government were very, very good here. The consulate talked to all the other centres, and Chicago got in touch with them, and we had Zoom meetings with them, and we set up something similar for them, or they used our template to do it. So, it just brings about the point that, when we work together, our mission was, there's no strength without unity, but you'll see it yourselves. When 5 organisations, and believe me, they weren't competing organisations, but they never had a reason to work together in that capacity. And when we harnessed our collective fundraising reach, and we set up a structure that people could focus their own donations, because so many GoFundMes were set up that people were very wary to give money to anything because they weren't sure what it was about. So once we got together and put our collective potential behind it, it really just showed what people can do when they're united, rather than the divisive rhetoric that's going on quite a bit here in the States at the moment.
Yes, so can you briefly tell me, just give us a picture, paint a picture, the profile of some of the applications you're getting, sort of the most needed cases.
I think the most needed cases would maybe people who are not receiving any other assistance. First, in our first tier, there would be families with children who would be looking for assistance with rent and for food supplies, for food security. And our second tier really would be people with maybe medical issues that needed to be addressed. And the third tier then would be more individuals who may be sharing accommodation, so their costs wouldn't be as high. They might be splitting rent or whatever it is. But I think, just to give you some idea of what we did, over the course of the last 5 or 6 weeks, we raised over close to $450,000, but we had over 440 applications. And of that, we've responded at the moment to over 400 of them. And people have received checks as a result of the application. And we've helped over 650 people. Some of those may be family units with over 100 children. And also Shane Humphreys, who was on the committee with us, works in property management downtown with Mike Riley. And they came up with the idea of advertising jobs that were available in Manhattan. And we've placed up to 20 people in jobs, which not only takes them out of the Sláinte fund, but it also gives them a reason to, it also helps them going forward as well. So I think the biggest lesson is that maybe we had been taking things for granted, because up until now the economy was good, people were working, there wasn't a word about any need for assistance, unless there was very special cases that came up. But it just made it quite clear to us that there are a lot of people who are living from paycheck to paycheck. And when something like this happens, and it happens very, very easily, within 2 to 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, people are in serious financial trouble very, very quickly with very little support.
Yes, I think the need is always there, but luckily the community is there, individuals like you as well. I want to bring Shaun in right now, because again, you are dealing, the American Ireland Fund have a very large COVID-19 response initiative. Could you tell us some of the critical areas you're focusing on?
Yeah, thanks, Maura. And I feel humbled listening to the work that the fellow panelists have been really leading in these difficult times. I suppose we're a little bit different. We're not really on the front lines. We're supporting those organizations that are dealing directly with the issues. And as we looked at it very quickly, sort of late March going into April, what we were focusing on, where could we, where were the needs, where could we make an impact, and particularly with organizations that were in a position to help and address the issues. But like Danny said, in terms of, listening, what are the needs and how can we help? And we identified 7 areas. And I think as you listen to the discussion, as we all know, this pandemic, nobody has been immune to it. And in fact, has impacted areas that were already maybe issues or had difficulties, like Caitríona was saying. So we identified 7 areas, from things that would have been, I suppose, very obvious, food supply, to domestic and child abuse, to supporting the elderly, to access to education. I think so. Said earlier, one thing that the pandemic has done is highlight some of the inequalities, and access to laptops or iPads to get the education. Some of the work that was being done through organizations dealing with mental health, dealing with domestic abuse, that had to go online and virtual, but had no infrastructure support to do that. At the same time, their sources of income were disappearing. So we were pretty quickly. We were lucky that we have a team on the ground in Ireland led by Caitríona. We already had many organizations who we've worked with in the past. And, I think the point that Caitríona made about giving comfort to donors that their money was going and resources were going to the right things, we were able to do that through our network, and we're able to match donors. Donor advised funding is a big piece of what we do. So we've been able to match over 1.7 million of donor advised to the right organizations, on top of our own resources that we've been able to deliver to multiple organizations like the ones we're talking about here, across all those areas.
Right. So you reallocated some funds from the American Ireland funds, and then, as you said, donor advised, and then obviously there's an appeal out there for the public to come in and to sponsor some key programs. So out of the 7 areas that you identified, are there any 1 or 2 that come to mind, an organization that come to mind that sort of resonated with you or made an impact with you?
No, they're all great organizations. It's hard to pick, like, who's your favorite child? But you certainly look, I think one that we have supported for many years, and we're able to dive in, and one in Belfast, everyone we know, 174 Trust, Reverend Bill Shaw, North Belfast. In normal times, working in a very difficult environment, dealing with some really difficult issues. Their funding went away overnight. They had to close the centre. They had their staff at risk, but it also been because of obviously the credibility they have in the space. Belfast City Council had identified them to manage the food pantry and food delivery program. We were able to support them so they could keep the team in place to do that, and supporting over 350 families across Belfast. Again, we knew we get it quickly and be able to make an impact. I think in broader, another one, Bernardo's. I think everybody would be familiar with Bernardo's. I think probably we're not as familiar, some of us not familiar what they're doing today. It's not just about supporting disadvantaged children, it's broader domestic and child abuse, and a lot of their work is hands-on, working with families and children at risk. Again, when the pandemic hit, they had to move to virtual, providing their services virtually. And in fact, the needs increased exponentially. A lot of the families they support are in emergency housing. So you may have a family of 4 or 5 in one room, no proper cooking facilities. You may have parents who already have mental health issues. We were able to provide them the support so they could put the infrastructure in place, get the equipment they needed to go virtual. And they, in a 4-week period, they helped over 1,700 families dealing with all ranges of issues in that space. So there too, but they're all across, men's sheds, Food Cloud, a whole range of organizations. And we're now moving to our next phase where we want to help, smaller community groups that are really making a difference. So smaller support to really get it on the ground where it's needed.
Yeah, I think you have, this is going to be ongoing for you. I think your ongoing challenge is to sort of keep these projects in the forefront of donors' minds so that you can get those contributions. But I want to go quickly to Danny and Brian, because we didn't really talk about what stage is your project at now. Are you winding down? Brian, you mentioned the structures in place so that if you need to reactivate it again, you can. Is that correct?
Yes, as we said, we did define the mission specifically, and there is great concern that there would be a second round of this. Hopefully, the healthcare has learned their lessons from being caught in such along with the rest of society, but caught in such a unprepared state, so that if there is a resurgence, that at least they have the processes sorted out, and they will be able to access the necessary protective equipment. But that being said, we were very proud of the fact that we were able to accomplish what we decided to do, a very limited the distribution to those frontline workers. That was done. We decided at this weekend that just passed that would be our last major distribution, as the number of fatalities in particular, but even the number of active cases have precipitously declined, and the need is no longer there. The economic impact is still the same, so we're in the process over the next couple of weeks of writing the last checks for restricted direct donations to the hospitals. One of the things that was very rewarding about this was, aside from the primary, as Danny said, it was wonderful to give the not only provide the actual physical, the protective equipment to the frontline staff. Most of the healthcare workers who really were dealing with those people who were so sick were women, and they were women who, working class women, who were really registered nurses, LPMs, or partners, care partners. And so there was a great deal of appreciation that the Irish American community rose up to the challenge to support their sisters on the lines, on the front line working. And that psychological support that they received, they really articulated in a very loving way to us that it was really almost as essential as receiving that equipment, that they knew that we as a people, as an organization, and as a community would rise up and show them that direct support. So that was the one half of it that was particularly rewarding. The other was to see Sophie Colgan and other young Irish people get involved and really develop as leaders, to see that the committee can function, and we were able to develop, to do that team building. And as it stands now, as we wrap up the initial stages of our mission, we will stand ready to support identified crises that impact particularly on our community, but also on a much greater metropolitan area. So we are wrapping up to a degree. We will maintain our structure, Sophie and I as co-chairs, and we will respond as needed should there be another rise in the incidence of it, or should there be any other need for an organization such as ours to have a targeted response to help other people.
Thank you, Brian. On that note, we do need to wrap up. I think we've gone a little over time, but you've all been, painted a great picture of what you do. We thank you for everything that you've done for the community, your role models for the audience watching, and for the community. If they want to get involved, they just pretty much have to step up and do it with trusted individuals. And anybody listening, watching, I kind of basically say, check out some of these websites and see there's still a live appeals going. If you want to contribute, donate your time, get involved to make a difference. But signing off, so thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.